With great pleasure to introduce Caroline Brazier. I've met Caroline for the first time this year when she's come over a couple of times to the university at Northampton. Wants to give a seminar, a really interesting seminar on her new book on guilt and exploration, and also to contribute to the psychotherapy aspect of module on the Masters in Transpersonal Psychology. So Caroline is I guess you're a founder of the Amida Trust, is that right?
One
yes.
of.
Pardon?
Yes. One of.
I know one of.
Yes.
One of the founders of the Amida Trust, which is based in relatively nearby Leicester. And some of our students have been over there and speak very, very positively and have had a very good experience of visiting the centre. And one of the master students stayed with you over the summer, I think.
Yes.
So Caroline is obviously an ordained nun within the Buddhist tradition, Japanese Buddhist tradition, isn't it? One of the Japanese Buddhist traditions. But also she's a psychotherapist and has written, and is a trainer of psychotherapists as well, and has written interesting books, very interesting books on Buddhist psychology. And she will put some out, I think, maybe tomorrow, certainly over the weekend. But she's going to talk particularly today because I so enjoyed her, and my colleagues enjoyed her seminar at Northampton, centred around the theme of her new book, which is guilt. And we had a nice talk about guilt first thing this morning, for those of us who came yesterday. And we've had some related themes as well in the first two talks. So certain themes may be emerging throughout the weekend. So I'd like to warmly welcome and hand you over to Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to start off just talking a little bit about how I came to be writing about guilt. And as Malcolm said, I had a book that came out in February, a long time ago now. I've had another one since then, but which is called Guilt and Exploration. And it is very much that. It is very much an exploration of the theme of guilt. And it came about really through the history of previous books that I'd written, which had been about Buddhist psychology and so on. So I've been going around and I've been talking to various people about the book and reading extracts from it and so on. And one of the things that struck me has been how strong people's reactions have been, because what I find is that the population of the world divides into two halves. There are those people who say, oh, wow, yes, I really want to read that. I'm really interested in that. What an interesting topic. And then there's the other half who say, guilt? What do you want to write about something like that for? You know, why, what an awful subject to write about. Well, it's quite interesting. I just had some feedback from a local group who actually took it as a book reading group. And they took it as their book to read for the last few months and were discussing it. And several of the people in the group, when they gave me some feedback, they said, well, the title would have put me off completely. You know, I would never have picked it up off the shelf. So it's a title that picks up strong reactions. And getting the sort of reactions from people, I get a sense that a lot of people feel guilty about feeling guilty. You know, it's interesting. They're quite sort of, they'll say, well, actually, yes, I do feel guilty sometimes. This is quite a strong thing. So I started to think about what this is about. But to go back a stage or two, like, why did I get to write about guilt? Well, as I say, part of the reasons came out of my Buddhist background, but part of it came out of my experience as a therapist, because I've worked as a therapist for about 15 years. And one of the things that always troubled me was hearing other therapists saying in a very sort of blanket way, it wasn't your fault, you were only a child. You know, this sort of response to people who felt guilt. And clients coming to me saying, well, this is what I was told by the last person. Because it seemed to me that this was too simplistic. It was putting a gloss on things. It was something that it didn't really go into the subject, and it didn't really do justice to the things the person was talking about. I could understand where people were coming from when they said it, because, obviously when somebody has experienced severe abuse and so on, then there is a huge mismatch of power. There are a whole lot of reasons why the person is experiencing that situation. They don't have the knowledge to deal with it. They don't have the social sense to be able to say no and so on. And yet, the child does have a social conscience, I believe. My own memories, when I think back to being a child, I could remember plenty of instances, times when I did things that I knew was wrong, times when I did things I knew my parents would disapprove of, times when I did things that I knew was unkind to other children. So it troubled me when people came back with this sort of blanket, well, it wasn't your fault, you're only a child kind of response. So this was one of the motivations I had for writing about guilt. The other motivation came from my Buddhist background. And, whoops, where's it gone? That's it. And in terms of Buddhist practice, I practice in the Pure Land School. And the Pure Land School has a very radical view of the human condition. In fact, it was very nicely put by one of the Pure Land teachers I heard recently, who, when asked about two positions that two opposing groups within the conference that I was at the time had, and which was the right one, said, "Oh, all bad. Pure Land has different view of things. Human beings, all bad." So that there is a sense that, yes, we're all bad, but we all go to the Pure Land. And this quote from Shinran, one of the founding fathers of Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, I think is a very nice one. Good people go to the Pure Land, how much more so bad ones? This is the sort of basic attitude of Pure Land Buddhism. There is no discrimination on the basis of judgment. Everybody is welcome in the Pure Land. So, and I'm going to say a bit more about this as I go on and look at some of the paradigms that underlie my thinking on guilt, so I'll just skip over it at the moment. But, I think these two contributing factors, both the Buddhist position on guilt and the fact that I felt uneasy experientially as a therapist with some of the responses of my clients, led me to write about guilt, and particularly to try and explore from the inside what it's like to be the child in the situation. So the book is actually, it's a story. Some people have said, is it autobiographical? It is, in as much as the circumstances of the group of children that I'm exploring takes place in the kind of circumstances in which I grew up, and that the children were not unlike the sort of people I hung around with, experiencing not unlike the sort of events that I experienced. But specifically, it's fictional and interspersed with commentary and discussion of the theme of guilt. What I'd like to look at, however, in this talk is to talk a bit about some of the background to guilt. And particularly I'd like to look at why guilt seems to be a problem in our modern age. What is it about guilt that makes it something that people feel guilty about? Why is it that so many people feel uncomfortable about their guilt feelings and aren't willing to really look at them and face them? And then conversely, what happens in therapy when the person, on the one hand, when the therapist themselves is unwilling to take the client into the guilt feelings, and secondly, if the client does look at the guilt feelings, what happens then? So that's basically what I want to do in this talk. So first of all, looking at the paradigms that contribute to our feelings of guilt. And here I want to be very broad brush, and I want to go fairly quickly because I want to allow some time at the end for discussion and so on. So apologies to people in terms of the sort of subtleties of things, because I'm aware that what I'm going to be saying is sort of very stereotyped. But okay, so what contributes to our current view on guilt? Whoops. Okay. Well, first of all, I think when one looks at guilt, often one immediately thinks the word guilt is associated with, in the Western tradition, the sort of Western theistic ideas that we've all grown up with. And here I do want to apologise deeply to my Christian friends, because I'm well aware that these are stereotypes. They're not the sort of views that most of my real Christian friends hold. And in fact, I think in many ways, as a society, we've internalized the stereotype views more than the more complex views of modern Christians. But nevertheless, we find in our thinking and in our language quite a lot of concepts that do come from the traditional biblical view of guilt, and particularly the Old Testament view. And so ideas like rights and justice, forgiveness, we had a talk already today on the subject of forgiveness, mercy, atonement. These ideas are ideas that have really come through our Western heritage and which we find just taken as read in a lot of circles. And they feed into ideas about guilt. They are authoritarian, they're based in a paradigm in which there is an external source of judgment and we in some way have to relate to that. Whether it's a benevolent source of judgment or whether it's a condemnatory source of judgment, it's external, it's powerful, and it's something that we have to deal with. Okay. More modernly, people have, in some ways in response to this, and I think particularly through the rise of the psychological and therapeutic professions, but also through the influence of psychological ideas in wider spheres in society, we've come up with a lot of ideas that counter those ideas of external authority. We've moved towards internal authority as being the predominant idea. We've come with ideas of equality, valuing of independence, the idea that people should be successful, the idea that there are certain norms that people should conform to, the idea that somehow there is a perfect me that I can become and that I develop towards, this sort of aspirational quality, an acquisitive quality, materialistic, getting the best of lifestyle. I mean, I'm aggregating a whole lot of trends here, you can see, and as I say, broad brush, but I think you get what I'm talking about. So there is this sort of paradigm, which itself then includes a sort of ethical relativism. Everything has a price. We juggle things in order to meet whatever needs there are in order to, and of course needs is another quality of this paradigm. So these two, very prevalent in the West. And, I have to say, speaking as a Buddhist, a lot of Buddhists have bought into these ideas. I read a lot of Buddhist literature and it often talks about human rights. It often talks about forgiveness. It often talks about justice. But actually, these aren't particularly Buddhist qualities. It's not that Buddhists are not in favour of the sort of things which are represented by those words, but they're not really concepts that we find in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, we find a paradigm which, again, in a lot of Buddhism, is rooted in an internal frame of reference. So individual responsibility, an idea of intentionality, an idea of things being controlled by the processes of karma. So what you do has certain effects. There are repercussions from things. It's a natural cause and effect thing. So if I do something, that will have effects which will then lead to other things, which will lead to other things, which will lead to other things. But it's not something that comes from some external judgment. It's something that just unfolds as a natural process. Compassion, an important Buddhist quality, particularly in Mahayana, the Eastern form of Buddhism. Contrition and regret, also important in Buddhism, although you won't hear them talked about in quite a lot of Western Buddhist circles, but actually very important. And generosity. Generosity is seen as the first virtue. So the first thing that's encouraged in lay Buddhists is dana, which is generosity. So different sort of paradigm. One which is much more about kind of just get on with it, do it. If you've done wrong, feel sorry for it. If somebody else does wrong, feel sorry for them. Be compassionate to them, and so on. And then, as I say, Pure Land Buddhism has a particular take within this. So if we look at the Pure Land paradigm, then what we're talking about is, well, in particular, the second of these, Bombu nature. Bombu nature is like the ordinary nature of the human being. The Bombu is the unenlightened person. It actually comes from a slightly longer phrase in Chinese, which means foolish beings of wayward passion. It's like we're enmeshed in years of karma, not only our own years of karma, but past lives karma, endless amounts of karma, karma from all our relatives, friends, everywhere else. We've just got endless layers of foolishness. And we're not going to transcend that very easily on our own. So Pure Land Buddhism is a relational form of Buddhism. It sees the source of rescue, the source of compassion, the source of enlightenment as being external to the self. You know, in a way, this is what all Buddhism is about. All Buddhism is about getting beyond self. But in Pure Land, it's very definitely located externally, and we relate to it. And so we don't actually have to have that perfection in ourselves, because the perfection is there, and the perfection is not judging us, it's accepting us. It's a radically non-judgmental framework. It's about we are accepted just as we are, really just as we are, to quote a little haiku, which I think is very nice and really just sort of holds the whole essence of it. But, you know, of course, for Westerners, this is actually very hard to take on, because we're always mediating that through a paradigm which says, oh, but hang on, I could be a bit better. Oh, but hang on, I really would like to be improving this. Oh, but hang on, if I could just do away with that bit of behaviour, or if I could just... You know, we're always wanting to tinker with ourselves. We are not prepared to just be just as we are, to be accepted just as we are. We're not satisfied with ourselves. And of course, you know, at a sort of day-to-day level, that has its importance, because actually recognising the things that we do wrong and changing them, it's important. We learn from it. But that recognition has to come from a position of not thinking that we are bad in a sort of ultimate way, not feeling that we are judged. If we actually feel held and loved and feel embraced by the universe, Buddha, or however we want to put it, if we actually feel that, then it's like we're able to, within that, look at something and think, well, actually, yes, I do need to do something about my irritability, or I do need to do something about my greed, or I do need to do something about whatever it is. But if we're all the time living in the light of some external judge, then it's like we're all the time sort of trying to cover up. We're trying to pretend it's not so. And these are sort of just very basic psychological dynamics. You know, we were talking about the child before. I mean, the child, you can see this very obviously. You can see the child that is loved, that is accepted, is much more willing to let the parents see when it does something wrong. The child that feels frightened, that feels judged, is going to be all the time covering up the mistakes it's made. And so what we're talking about in the Pure Land paradigm is one in which there is a sense of gratitude and a sense of other-relatedness, other-centeredness, and this radical non-judgmentalism. And out of that, what comes is a sense of fellow feeling, because if I actually get to the position of feeling, well, I do make mistakes, I'm ordinary, and so on, then I get to the sense where I can see other people's mistakes and I'm okay with them. I'm not judging them. Because if I'm not judged, then I'm not judging other people. And so I can meet other people in the sense of, yes, we're both Bombu. We both make mistakes. So, you know, I think in the West we are very much embracing these four paradigms are available to us, or at least available to me in my thinking about guilt. Going back to the predominating paradigms of the West, where I think we are stuck in this idea of trying to perfect ourselves and of a sort of residual sense of an external judge, I think we're very much left with a problem around the whole business of what do we do when things go wrong. The whole problem of how do I maintain my personal innocence? How do I stay perfect and yet recognize that something needs to be done about it? And this leads to a whole focus on business of blame. And I think what comes out of it is this attitude of it must never be allowed to happen again, which we hear all the time on the television, on the radio, in the newspapers. And what emerges is a blame culture. Blaming other people creates safety. It allows us to put it onto somebody else. It allows us the idea that things can be put right, that perfection is possible, so we preserve this myth of perfection. And it gives us an idea that everything can be controlled. The universe is something that if we can just find the culprit, sort it out, make sure it doesn't happen again, then everything can be controlled. Now, of course, the problem when you've got a predominating idea of blame and also self-esteem is that there's a paradox there. Because although all the time we are trying to put blame onto somebody else, of course, sometimes it comes home to roost. So how do we cope with this? In contrast to this, what I'd like to do is move into how does the Buddhist paradigm deal with this? Buddhist paradigm accepts the reality that things go wrong. This is a fundamental thing in Buddhism. So if we look at the teaching on the nature of things, this is a very standard Buddhist teaching. What does it say? It says everything is impermanent, everything is afflictive, everything is not self. So the idea that suffering is inherent in life and that nothing lasts and that the world is not under our control, it's not part of ourselves. This is bound up in the core of our understanding of things. And the picture here is of our community tending the grave in the natural burial ground of David's mother. So that acceptance, that putting of the nature of impermanence into the centre of our lives, something about facing the reality of it all. And this is also at the core of the Buddhist understanding of the person. Here I'm going to go rather fast through Buddhist psychology, so I've put up some... something funny's happened to the arrow. Never mind. That says identity underneath the arrow. A bamboo slide. Okay, well, it's changed since yesterday. Never mind. Okay, so just to give you a kind of very quick overview of the core principles of Buddhist psychology. Affliction is inevitable. Already talked about that. Fear of affliction leads people to create patterns of behaviour, particularly patterns of clinging. And initially, these are sensory things. We go for the biscuits, or we go for the coffee, or we go for the wine, or we go for the, the sort of thing. And then gradually, out of those patterns, we build an identity, and that identity we come to think of as ourselves. And all this is a defence against the unknown and the feared. And this is a little quote from the book. Our struggling minds, facing our powerlessness against life events, sickness, old age and death, may on the one hand rise to the occasion, taking courage to face the inevitable and harnessing our responses so that we grow in spiritual capacity, or on the other hand, may lose courage so that we fall into deceit and delusion, avoidance and escape. Most of us do the latter most of the time. We are ordinary, frightened beings struggling for survival. The gift of courage is rare. So what I'm describing here is really the spiritual task and also the bamboo situation. That on the one hand, the spiritual ideal is that we face these life events courageously, and on the other hand, that inevitably we don't. We get into a whole lot of patterns of things which actually are bamboo, that are in some way unskillful, let's say. So identity formation, identification with repeating habits and attachments, distinction from others. Difference creates identity. And here, of course, we see that blaming others, we create an external enemy. We feel more akin to the people that we're with. And so, of course, the blame culture becomes something of a support to identity. And so here we have another layer in the whole business of blame and guilt. If we can put the blame onto somebody else and we can agree that they're the baddies, then we can feel good, we can feel supported in our identity, we can feel more secure, more in control, and we join in the favourite British game of Ain't It Awful. Identity, our fragile protection against raw exposure to life's unpredictable harshness, is so much a reflection of the conditions we inhabit. Illusory, it quickly scatters in the confusion of new circumstances. And so identity, on the one hand, is something that we cling to, and at the same time it's something that is quite fragile. It's something that as soon as we lose those supports of the other people, that agreement that it's all their fault or whatever it is, we very soon lose it. And so it's like we're caught in between the two. We're very unwilling to let go of those ideas about society, about other people, because we know that if we do, or a bit of us knows that if we do, because it's not a conscious process, then we ourselves become vulnerable. Identity is formed at the individual level, but groups have identities too, and group identities particularly rely on asserting difference and scapegoating. He's saying the same thing. Okay, so the bamboo idea, this is the other. In the bamboo paradigm, it's expected that sometimes a person gets it wrong. It's expected that a person is dependent. It's expected that people rely on support. So when we are more in contact with our ordinary nature, then we become less dependent on keeping external enemies. We become less dependent on assuming that we can stand on our own feet and do everything independently. We become more willing to notice the internal supports in our group. And so particularly in society, in our social groups, we become more willing to recognise the interpersonal rather than the external distinctions. We don't have to all be the same. We can be different. We can appreciate the ways in which those differences offer support, rather than having to rely on a sense of we're all the same and they're the ones that have got the problems. And so we move into a position of, I'm not okay, you're not okay, it's okay. A bit tongue-in-cheek there, but I think there's a lot of truth in that, the basic acceptance that it's actually okay for all of us not to be okay. This is the position of fellow feeling that I was talking about. Okay, so dependence and collectivity owe space for human frailty. As Bombo, we can not know or get things wrong. So, like, the idea that we are dependent is very central. And in Buddhism, we have teachings which are the teachings on dependent origination. All things arise in dependence on causes and conditions. Those of you who've come across Buddhist ideas will be familiar with this very core teaching. And so, I think in terms of relationships, we can look at the way that whatever we do, however we are, is very much dependent on circumstances. And particularly, in Pure Land, we tend to emphasise the way that those circumstances basically are benevolent. Even though obviously they're a mixed bag, they're not all the, some things are good, some things are bad. Basically, we're here, we're alive, we're living varying degrees of creative lives. And so there is an indication there that basically the conditions that have given rise to our lives are benevolent. There may be odd things that have gone wrong, but there's an awful lot that's gone right. And we tend to, as Bombu, see the things that have gone wrong and not put much emphasis on the things that have gone right. So whilst the Western paradigm emphasises self-sufficiency and independence, the Pure Land position emphasises dependence, and particularly puts focus on gratitude and generosity and mutual support. And, here I can mention as an aside, there's a form of therapy called NICAN therapy, which is particularly a life review therapy in which one looks at the history of one's life and the way in which one has been dependent on others. And one works with the questions, what has this person done for me? And one starts off with one's mother and then moves on to one's father and then moves on to other relationships. What has this person done for me? What have I done in return? What trouble have I caused? It can be very sobering when you work with those sorts of questions. You become acutely aware of, actually, that, yes, we have received far more and we have been not nearly grateful enough. I mean, I have a friend, Greg Kretsch, who runs the Todo Institute in North America, where they specialise in NICAN, and he runs long retreats with people, and he'll get them doing things like adding up how much money did your parents spend on you, and how much have you spent on your parents? Things like that. How many nappies did your mother change when you were a baby? How many times were you sick over her? Very practical things. Let's get down to earth on this. All this airy-fairy stuff is all very well, but, babies are pretty down-to-earth creatures at the end of the day. I just want to mention the idea of interdependence because this is something that comes up a lot in Buddhism. Actually, it's a particular example that's given. We like to think that we're interdependent because it sounds good, because, then there's some mutuality about it. But actually, in the Abhidharma, which is the Buddhist psychological texts, the theory of interdependence is just one amongst many different forms of conditions that give rise to mental states and to the phenomena. But it's a relatively rare one. In most situations, we are just downright dependent. So whether it's air, light, or these lovely men who are cooking for us in France, and this is the kind of food you can get at our retreat centre in France, we're just dependent on others to keep us alive, and we're dependent on the environment, we're dependent on animals, we're dependent on plants, we're dependent on all sorts of things. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for other things. Okay, so that's a bit of background. That's the sort of broad theory, the paradigms that I'm drawing on. Now I'd like to look at the therapeutic relationship and the effect of different ideas about guilt in the therapy relationship. So, moving on, what effect does it have on the client to be told by the therapist that they're not guilty? I started off with the idea that therapists often hold that you were only a child, you couldn't possibly have done it. If your therapist holds this view and you go to them as a client and you're talking about something that happened in your childhood, what effect does it have? Therapists tend to avoid guilt. They tend to, for the best will in the world, most therapists, they want to give a warm atmosphere to the client. They don't want to be judgmental, and they feel that if they see the client as guilty, then they'll be being judgmental. So they tend to try and find ways around it. The client tells a story about childhood. The therapist tries to find a way around it. Well, first of all, there is the "you were only a child" response. Not always said as directly as that, but often communicated in some way in the phrase that's had. Or they somehow depotentiate what's being said. They give the impression it wasn't that bad, was it? What you did, you might have gone and kicked that other child or stolen their sweets or something, but, it wasn't that bad, was it? Could have been a lot worse than that. Or they project it onto others, and I think this is quite a common one. Well, it wasn't your fault. What were your parents up to at the time? What was your teacher doing when that happened? So 3 of the ways that therapists avoid facing the client's guilt. So when the therapist doesn't recognise guilt, what happens? Well, sometimes I think the client realises that the therapist isn't being straightforward. They realise that the therapist is covering up. What goes through their mind? What I did must have been unspeakably bad. No, my therapist here can't bear to actually agree with me that I did the wrong thing there. So, that must mean that actually it was just so bad that they're trying to cover up. But it must have been really awful. And of course then there becomes a loss in trust because the client realises that the therapist is in some way being inauthentic. Okay, so that's one scenario. Another scenario is the client believes the therapist. They think the therapist genuinely does think that what they did wasn't as bad as the client really knows that it was. And so the client then thinks, well, the therapist is much too nice a person to see how bad I really am. But if they really knew the truth, they wouldn't accept me. So again, it undermines the therapeutic relationship. So the client learns to reframe the guilt into blame, make it somebody else's fault. They learn to repress thoughts and feelings relating to guilt, maybe. And they learn to feel guilty about feeling guilty. Back to where I started. Okay, so I'd like to just unpack some of the aspects of guilt that came out for me in going into the experience of guilt. So when I wrote the book, I took the scenario of a group of children growing up, 10-year-olds, living in London in the 60s, which is when I was growing up, in a gang, getting into all the sorts of scrapes that I used to get into and a few others. And I looked at the sort of nuances of feeling and thought that went on for them. I didn't particularly try to be encyclopedic, though it was quite interesting because when I got to the end of the book, I looked back at a framework. You see, initially I thought I was going to write a more theoretical book, so I sort of sketched out my chapter headings of all the different sorts of guilt I wanted to cover and all that sort of thing, and thought, yes, I'll go through these. And then once I actually started writing, I started off with an illustration, and getting into the illustration, what I realised was that actually I wasn't going to do justice to the subject by just giving a quick sort of one-page summary and then discussing it, because it would be too simplistic. I realised that I was actually dealing with a very complicated subject in which there were a lot of nuances, in which the interpretations were actually were open to interpretation. It didn't have easy answers to it, and I didn't want to give definitive answers. And so in a way I'm doing here what I avoided doing in the book by giving some definitive answers. But when I looked back over what I'd written, I actually found that I'd covered most of the areas that I'd intended to write when I wrote out my original framework, which was quite interesting. So here what I've done is I've tried to pull out some of the themes that I think are quite interesting relating to guilt. They're not encyclopedic, and I know even from the conversations I've been having so far today that there are plenty of other things we can go, and if I get on with it, then we should have some time to discuss some of them. So let's unpack guilt. Okay, so what have we got? Looking at guilt feelings. Language is slippery, but so are human minds. We slip between concepts, confusing the feeling of guilt with its actuality. So first thing is that I think one needs to be clear about real guilt, as in the sort of legalistic sense of something has been done that is wrong and somebody is guilty of having done that action, and feelings of guilt. So feelings of guilt can be a whole range of things, and those are the things I want to unpack in a minute. Substituting self-criticism and longing for things not to be so with true remorse and a will to make amends. So often there's a sort of slipperiness in our reaction to it. And often this is the sort of shame bit of it. It's the sort of keeping face, that we beat ourselves up for not being what we thought we should be. We resent our unsettled consciences and blame others for imposing guilty feelings on us. Guilty feelings aren't comfortable. We don't like them. Whilst clinging to those same feelings and failing to move on. What is it that makes us cling to feelings of guilt? What is it that keeps us awake at night, that won't let us put it down? Well, of course, one of the things that's often thought of with guilt is the whole business of taboo, and particularly sexuality, and we've got the Adam and Eve picture here. Social taboos, things that society considers to be dangerous in some way. Sex, religion, power, death, difference, I've got listed here as some of the sort of taboos that we might feel guilty around in the West. And I think these sort of social taboos, they're very deeply rooted, and obviously we can talk at some length about those sorts of areas, but they're the sort of areas that kind of, when we've crossed a social boundary in these areas, we feel a deep uncomfortableness in ourselves that comes out of having broken that taboo in some way. Confusion and secrecy mask spontaneous pleasure, and certain knowledge arises that this is danger, at which parents have hinted but not dared to speak directly. Hidden in the secret spaces of the mind, where stories we tell ourselves conflict with our deep-known truth, we feel guilt arising. In the first scent of excitement and danger, as our sexual instincts start to emerge, conflicted and silenced, we sometimes wish we could return to childhood innocence. Other guilt feelings might arise from our whole relationship with the group. So groups have particular norms and ground rules, and as we identify with those, we may feel guilty for having had different norms and ground rules in the past. We criticize ourselves from deviating from them. We internalize the group's criticism, and sometimes we identify with the group shadow. Each group will have its shadow, its ideas of what's wrong, its unacceptable bits. Sometimes we identify with that. Sometimes secretly we identify with that, because being shadow is actually something that's being projected by the group, but of course all the group members have it, and so the group members probably secretly recognize that and feel guilty about it. We slide between the worlds of allegiance and rejection. The complexity of the rule books which underpin our feelings of guilt changes. Social groups set their codes, create their priorities grounded in different values. While some norms seem absolute, common to most societies, there is little that is not acceptable, even lauded somewhere. So different groups have different rules, and of course some of the problem that we face is often that we belong to more than one group, and so we have conflicting pulls on ourselves, and so often we're in a can't-win situation, because if we do it right by one group, we're doing it wrong by the other group. Maybe arising from that, guilt maybe arise from feelings of trying to be in control. Sometimes it's easier to be a villain than a victim. If I feel guilty, then at least I'm in control of the situation. I chose to do the wrong thing. Whereas if I'm just a complete victim of the situation, then I'm at the mercy of bigger forces than myself. So taking responsibility gives us power. It's all part of this business of how we live in an unpredictable universe. If we go back to the basic uncertainty of things, impermanence of things, presence of affliction, and so on, that I talked about in the Buddhist paradigm. One of the ways that we may try and control that psychologically, if we're not able to recognize it, is to get guilty. Perhaps guilt is a soft option. Perhaps we choose guilt because it means taking responsibility. Perhaps the alternative would be to say that we have no choice. We are just corks in the tide of chance. Perhaps in guilt we cling to the last vestiges of identity and to the sense of agency in our lives. Perhaps we cannot face our powerlessness. Okay. Guilt as protection. So sometimes guilt can be a way of warding off other people. What I call "you can't kick me when I'm on the ground" mentality. If I make myself bad, then you can't be angry with me because I'm saying how bad I am. It's a bit like the animal turning on its back. if I'm bad, you won't have any expectations of me. I think that's quite a common one. If I label myself as a bad person, then you can't expect me to get it right and be perfect and so on. There are moments when we just wish we could turn the clock back. There are times when, despite our best efforts, the universe catches us in its web, bundles us up and dangles us on a thin thread. There are times when we watch others struggle like some unfortunate fly against the sticky threads of inevitability. Guilt may arise from a sense of trying to preserve our sense of perfection. And I think this is a big one, actually. Often that sort of guilt where you can't let it go, where you feel guilty night after night, you're kind of, why did I do that? What's really going on there? I think what's really going on there is often that we have a higher sense of ourselves than what we are. We're not really acceptant of the fact that we are bombu, we're ordinary beings, we're not enlightened, we're not perfect, we get things wrong. So that sort of persistent guilt, I think, is often tied up with identity. The problem with guilt is we feel we shouldn't have it. We should be perfect and immune from criticism, especially from our own consciences. It's not so, for we are ordinary and our nature is to get things wrong. We struggle between uncertainties and sometimes do our best, but often not. This is the rich complexity of our lives. And sometimes the being guilty becomes an identity in itself. If I've always felt guilty, it's familiar, and so I identify with it. And I think this is an interesting thing, actually, with all bad, negative feelings, negative self-image. People can have a very strong self-image that is negative. And so the image of myself as a guilty person can be something that, although it's uncomfortable, it offers a kind of protection. So just as the identity is the protection against the uncertainties of life, the afflictions of life, and so on, it's something that we build up and we create as our sort of habit pattern. The habit of feeling guilty can itself be a form of identity. And guilt feelings may have been learnt from other people. Fear of rejection is deeply ingrained from childhood, and if a person's experienced a lot of criticism, they tend to internalise the critic and become self-critical and critical of others. A person who is used to critical others will tend to replicate relationships that are critical. So there is a tendency to just internalise what we're used to. We all know this. At our deepest level, we feel rejection. Cut off from the light of parental approval and protection, the child falls into the hellish realm of shades, inviting such disapproval as like spiritual suicide. It lets dark clouds of guilt seep into the soul. It eats away confidence and hollows one's beings. So children hide the unforgivable aspects of themselves. And so this whole business of the parental relationship, we come back to it. It's very important. But it has ramifications in terms of people's sense of guilt in all manner of different ways. And guilt feelings may be ways of reconciling impossible demands. I talked about this in relation to being members of two groups. But it can be different things. Internalized others, childhood voices, parental conflicts, where two parents have completely different views. The child may feel guilty in order to reconcile that, and the person who's caught between cultures. Okay, so how does one approach the whole business of working with guilt? Well, I think from a Buddhist point of view, often what one is doing is one is taking a much more pragmatic approach to guilt. One tries to look at guilt more just as one other emotion amongst the range of emotions. And so the sort of basic pragmatic stance to guilt is, did you do it? What can you do about it? What can you learn from it? Move on. Easier said than done, but, if I'm talking about sort of what's a simple relationship with guilt, that would be it. I think also what one comes to is the idea of the therapist's role. And I think here one has to go back to the sort of spiritual context, and I think the therapist has an important role as a confessor. You know, the whole business of confession is a very important spiritual quality, being able to confess. And it is about getting to an honest position with oneself, but having a witness to that brings an objectivity. It brings a sense of somebody else holding that that confession. So, objectivity, honesty, and sometimes I think that sense of wanting absolution. You know, I think we have to accept that when somebody actually tells us about something that they feel guilty about, then they may be looking for something from us. And that may be some sort of a sense of absolution, which of course involves a kind of transmission. You know, what's that about? It's about somehow being the channel for that spiritual energy which says, you're okay just as you are, really just as you are. As in the confessional, the secret guilt once voiced loses potency. Guilt hangs over us, contaminating our being, seeking resolution. We long to tell, release the imprisoned knowledge of our wickedness. We seek a friend, a confidant, a powerful figure who can hold the force which threatens to overwhelm us, who has the power to give absolution, to comfort, to restore us to innocence. We long to retreat into the womb of another's compassion, our naked, evil selves, huddling in the arms of our protector, willing to take whatever penance is ascribed in return for surrender. And I think here you see that sort of combination of the wanting the neutral witness, but also the wanting the acceptance and the holding, which of course is the mirror of the spiritual presence. So, helpful therapeutic attitudes, an attitude of inquiry, a belief that the facts are friendly, a sense of faith in something bigger, that there is a presence, a spiritual presence which is basically benign, compassionate, loving, whatever it is that is bigger than both therapist and client. And here I can refer to the work of Jisho Saiko, a Japanese Buddhist priest who was also a psychologist, who wrote about Shinshu counseling, which basically is founded on the idea that the therapist and the client meet in the presence of, in his case, Amida Buddha, but whatever spiritual presence you feel, and that the therapist is in touch with that presence. And it's the therapist's faith which actually holds the relationship and allows the client to eventually find their own faith. Looking at other perspectives, through the investigation of the situation, the therapist is able to help the client to look at the whole picture of the situation about which they feel guilty. And a sense of fellow feeling, that the therapist themselves is aware of their own fallibility, that they're not coming from a position of perfection, they're coming from a position of also being Bombu, the I'm not okay, you're not okay, it's okay position. Because when we meet our clients in that position and we're aware of our ordinary nature, then it's like we can allow them to be ordinary too, without judging. And just to finish, this is a comment that I had recently from somebody when we were discussing the subject. It's a liberation to look at our shadow side. Embracing our guilt, we become free. So, a quick whistle-stop tour of guilt. Thank you very much. I think we've... I think I've managed to leave a little bit of time for questions and discussion.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Caroline. Questions then? Should we do the... Yes?
It's only a little question. I was interested to hear when you said that people feel guilty for feeling guilty, because I try to imagine what that would be like. Do you get many people who feel guilty because they don't feel guilt about something? Which to me would resonate.
Yes, that's an interesting one. Yes, I'm sure that happens sometimes. Yes, I mean there are many permutations, aren't there? Yes, and I suppose again I would have the sense of the facts are friendly. You know, if you don't feel guilty about it and you feel you should feel guilty about it, then let's look at it. What's it about?
How many people
Well, I think because there is such a sort of you should not feel guilty kind of mentality around. And also because guilt is so much sort of played up. I mean, because of the sort of, I think there are several things at work. I think there is the sort of, on the one hand, there is a sort of pop psychology kind of culture of you mustn't feel guilty. And then also, you've got this sort of blame culture going on in which to feel guilty and be labelled as guilty is kind of very bad. And so, I think the two of them conspire together that people, if they do feel guilty, they feel bad about it. Yeah.
Do you think guilt is not also seen as being kind of indulgent by some people? They might say it as if you feel guilty about something as you're kind of wallowing in it, almost like self-pity.
Yes, I think it can be, yes. And maybe that's a sort of intuition that sometimes the guilt is about wallowing in it and really has more to do with having a sort of expectation that I should be perfect and so on. So I think sometimes it is that we do have that intuition, that it's very much tied up in that.
Thank you for that, Caroline. Do you think one of the problems with looking at this very difficult, very complex emotion of guilt is there are different types of guilt? There could be neurotic guilt, where you feel guilty for things you've not done, as opposed to much more constructive guilt, where you do feel guilty about something you have done wrong, and you can actually learn from that. And also a difference between individual guilt and collective guilt, where you might feel guilt because your team has done something wrong or your group has done something wrong.
Oh, yes, I think that's very much the case. And, I think it is this complexity that I'm wanting to unpack, that we're not just talking about one subject at all. We're talking about a whole range of things. But I think the sort of unwillingness to look that you get in some quarters actually means that they all get lumped together and that people have rather simplistic sort of, well, that's all guilt and that's all shame and, but actually I think when you start to look into it and when you start to unpack the different things, there's a whole lot. And I think the example you gave of the sort of collective guilt, I think is very interesting. And, the whole business about when you're expected to feel guilt for something because of something your group's done and how you handle that and so on and what you feel. And, some of the business like, nations being expected to feel guilty for things that their ancestors did. North Americans being expected to feel guilty for slavery or Germans being expected to feel guilty for the Nazis. How do you handle that? In a sense, it is in that collective karma, and yet, at the same time, as an individual, you weren't even born then. So, it's very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Caroline. On the point of Bombu, this Pure Land view of things, I don't practice this particular religion. It was Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism. Nichiren Daishonin was a very this is the 14th century sage, Buddhist sage, Nichiren Daishonin, was very much opposed to the Pure Land sect. He said because they, I can see the danger of Bombu in accepting injustice.
Yes.
So you just sort of go, oh well, we're living in a perfect world, let's just sit on our backsides and not challenge it. And he was very critical of the shogunate at that time in Japan, of how the Pure Land sect was teaching people, just accept suffering. And a bit like some aspects of Catholicism where you go to heaven and you get your reward there, so just keep your heads down.
Yes.
So there's a danger, isn't there, with
oh yes, there certainly is. Yes, there are pitfalls in it.
Accepting your lot and not challenging it. So guilt may have a function there in us.
Yes, but these are also things which Shinran and the other Pure Land teachers saw as pitfalls, and certainly if you read Shinran's letters, he speaks very strongly against that kind of attitude.
Right,
it certainly is a pitfall of that kind of attitude. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
So David and then Jess and
Caroline, thank you very much indeed for your presentation, which I'm sure we all found very valuable indeed. And I think among the enormously important things that you mentioned, one of the most critical is this idea of internalising the critic. And you know that in therapy this is often expressed as I victimises me. So me is the poor old actor who does things and gets things wrong.
Yes.
I is the kind of superego voice that sits on top and says, you fool, you realise what a mess you made of that. What on earth are people going to think of you?
Yes.
In a sense, this is almost the language of the parent or the language of the teacher or whatever.
Yes.
And that internalisation is often very, very difficult to shake.
Yes.
Because people have grown up with it.
Yes. Well, that's right. And also it's got very much incorporated into the sense of self. It's like we build our identity out of all the things that are external to us, and whatever resources we have, we create the identity out, and then the identity becomes the protection. And so it's the fact that it's become part of the identity that is what makes it so difficult to shake off. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Caroline, I want to take you back to the idea of intergenerational guilt.
Right. Yes.
Being from Germany, that's precisely something that I've been, living with.
Yes.
And something that really interests me there is the kind of processes of transformation that may be involved, also on an intergenerational level.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that, perhaps from a Buddhist perspective, if you've come across something there. I mean, from my own experience, my grandparents, obviously, there was that sense of guilt. With my parents who were born after the war, there was already a change more in the sense of personal responsibility, which is still now carrying on, I would say, in my generation. But there is this sense of that even needs to change to something that is becoming more... Something where we don't just remember, which is where we seem to be stuck as a nation, perhaps in Germany. We remember, we must not forget.
Yes.
And how do we move that on into something that may become more of a productive value, if you see what I mean?
Yes. I mean, I think it's very difficult. And I think it is, in a way, in the process of going into these experiences that we actually start to... transform them, but I think the process of transformation isn't one we can predict, because if we could, then it would be something of ourselves rather than something that is other that comes to us. Having said that, I think that, I think there are different things that come out of it. I think that one thing that would come out of it would be that if we can look honestly at the past, and then there are possibilities to learn from it. So that's one thing. So as with any guilt, if we can look at it, then there are positive outcomes in terms of learning from it. But I think more than that, if one is coming from the sort of bamboo position, then what one has to recognise is the capacity that one has in oneself to do these things. I think this is one of the things that has been so difficult in the 20th century, actually. And I think a lot of the second half of the 20th century was about European society trying to in some way deal with the fact that some members of European society had behaved in these ways. And, whether you were German, whether you were British, whatever you were, in a way you couldn't unknow that. There was a sort of loss of innocence there. And... and I think different nations probably dealt with it in different ways. And you can see at the sort of national levels these different strategies. Because, I think in some ways the British and the French and all the other nations probably looked and thought, well, thank goodness it wasn't us. We wouldn't behave like that. And so it's the sort of putting it outside kind of attitude. Whereas I think, if you're German, then you have to say, well, yes, it was my ancestors that did it, my immediate antecedents that did it. And so there is much more telling aspect. But actually, all of us have that capacity. All of us have cruelty in us. All of us have the ability, given the wrong circumstances, to act in those kinds of ways. And that's really scary. It's like that puts us into this position where we're not in control. It's not us that determine whether we behave in those kind of bad ways, ultimately. It's actually much more to do with the conditions of our lives. Even if we think, well, I wouldn't do that because I have more moral sense than that. Where does that moral sense come from? It's something that we've learnt through our lifetime. It's something that we've been given as a grace. It's something that's maybe come through some spiritual source. It's not something that we have created in ourselves. And so I think that sort of humility that comes from realising that on the one hand, we can learn something from looking at it, but on the other hand, we have to know that actually we have to reach out a hand of support to people who have found themselves in the wrong circumstances.
There's the Joan Baez song, isn't it, from the 60s generation, There But for Fortune.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Yes.
Yes. Ruth's got the magic.
I really enjoyed your paper. I think it's bringing up a lot of provocative things. And I just wanted to say, give a couple of thoughts. I was very struck by what you were saying about this need to preserve our sense of perfection, and I think that's very powerful.
Yeah.
And I wonder, therefore, if that sets up its opposite, where we can feel very inferior and small and little or belittled. And I suppose thinking of Germany, I'm sort of thinking post-First World War, how so deeply humiliated the German nation was by the Allies, that it then set up something which almost became grandiose in its attempt to make up for probably the feelings of appalling humiliation. So it was just a thought. But the other thing I was just intrigued with is, of course, in the West, we rather have this myth of original sin, a kind of redemption project that we're all having to be better and improve and become and all this sort of thing. I just wondered what the Bombu mythology is or was as by comparison, because in a way our myth is so deeply embedded, it's quite difficult to pull ourselves out of that Christian Judaic.
Yes. Well, the Buddhist paradigm has quite a few myths to it. So first of all, you've got a basic sense of continuity in the Buddhist. I mean, the whole attitude to time is different. The Western idea has a beginning, middle, and end kind of thing, whereas the Buddhist idea is of continuous state. Cycles, a Buddha is born and then the world falls into decay, and then another Buddha is born, but it's a continuing process. There isn't a sort of beginning and end to it. There's no creation story in Buddhism. So that's one thing. And then Pure Land specifically has the Pure Land Sutras, which tell of a Buddha of an earlier age, Amida Buddha, who, initially of a disciple, Dharmakara, a monk, who makes vows that he will create a Pure Land in which, if people have faith in him, all will be enlightened. And so there's a sort of mythology in that of the creation of a place which is all-welcoming, of this all-powerful Buddha, and Amida means without measure, measureless life, measureless light, are the two images that are associated with Amida. And so you have this sense of a universal, omnipresent, all-loving presence who is not prepared to achieve Buddhahood unless all beings can achieve Buddhahood as a result. So it's a sort of ultimate bodhisattva ideal, if you like. So these are two of the sort of mythologies that I think underpin the Buddhist ideal, but there are many. No, there's no sense of judgment at all. Though, of course, there's, as I talked about, there's the idea of karma. This is the sort of regulating force which comes from the whole Indian religious framework. It's not just Buddhist, but in Buddhism, the idea of karma is certainly one of the factors that's taken into account. But it's a much more mechanical process. It doesn't require a judge. Yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. I enjoyed your presentation very much. I quite agree with you that it just doesn't work telling people that they should, not be guilty.
Yeah.
Any more than it works telling people they should forgive.
Yes.
Sometimes you can help a person on the way to forgiveness if you ask them if they wish that they could forgive. And even if they can't forgive, somewhere they know in them that there is that desire to be able to forgive. And I think that plants a seed that sometimes grows.
Yes.
But your discussion of guilt set me thinking about love in the face of guilt. And I remembered a teenage girl that I saw who was very depressed and full of guilt over the death of her little brother, who had died of some infectious illness. And of course, she'd been terribly jealous of him. It was one of those very impoverished families, and he'd arrived and she'd been displaced, and she was very angry with him. And then he got ill and died, so she was left carrying this guilt through her childhood, and it really had a devastating effect on her, especially as her parents were not very loving. And she was very withdrawn. And so we had to talk about the guilt, and she did, and it wasn't a question of trying to relieve her of it.
No.
But then I said to her, but you must have loved him very much too. And at that point she burst into tears and said, no one's ever asked me that before.
Yes.
And we then talked about the fact that she loved the brother that she hated. And that seems to me often a way forward,
Yes.
rather than trying to dislodge the guilt as such. Would you agree?
It's a very moving story, yes. Yes. And yes, I mean, certainly that would be an important factor. I mean, yes, I don't think I can add to what you've said. Thank you.
Okay, I'll make mine quick. The only question I was going to say, if once you have agreed with somebody that they're right to feel guilty, what is the kind of reaction that you get? I know the sort of reaction I might have got, so I was interested to find out what has happened. If you say, yeah, you're right to feel guilty, you are bad. You were in the wrong.
I'm not sure I've ever actually said that. I think it's not so much that I would say to the person, you're right to feel guilty, or you're wrong to feel guilty, or whatever. I think it's more that in my manner of listening to them, I would listen to the guilt as much as any other feeling. And I would recognise that was a valid feeling, and so on.
But you do validate the guilt?
Yes, yes. As with any other feeling, yes, yes. I mean, it's what they're feeling at the moment. And I would also be listening for the other feelings, like love or whatever. So, you know, I think... I mean, I think that my attitude would be summarised by, like Rogers's idea, the facts are friendly. No, I think that kind of attitude of, let's look at what's really there. You know, what is really going on. And sometimes I think, you know, that you get that by going more deeply into it. And sometimes you get it more from stepping back from the situation. And sometimes you get it from looking at the situation through different angles. You know, and I'll be talking tomorrow in the workshop that I'm doing a bit more about how you get different perspectives. So, like with the situation you were talking about, you know, one of the things I might do with that girl talking about her brother and her feelings of guilt might be just to take her a bit back from it, so she looks at the story of the girl with the brother who died in the third person, so she can get a bit of distance from it, and she starts to look at it, and she starts herself to get a sense of how it is to see that girl with all her conflicted feelings and explore the different feelings that are there. And so, you know, I think sometimes I would be looking from different angles and so on. But I don't think I would be judging the feeling either in terms of saying it's right to feel guilty or it's wrong to feel guilty. You feel guilty.
Caroline, you never sort of mentioned the positive aspects of guilt, namely that it stops you doing things wrong in the future.
Right.
I mean, I remember when I was very young, when I was at preparatory school, I used to lead a gang, and we used to steal things from the tuck shop. And I used to really enjoy that until I got caught and I got beaten, and after that felt really guilty about it. And I often wondered whether, if I hadn't been caught, I would have gone on to be a bank robber or something. But so clearly being inculcated with a sense of guilt serves a useful function as well.
Yes.
So, I mean, is that fully compatible with what you were saying in the Buddhist perspective?
Oh, yes, and I think I did mention sort of learning from the experience. And so, yes, I mean, I think there are different ways in which one learns from it. I think at the sort of rough and ready level, the being told off and the shame of being told off can change our behaviour. And so, that in itself can be useful. I think what's more useful, though, is to see the consequences. And I think from a Buddhist framework, one of the things that the Buddha keeps saying in the sutras is, and he saw the consequence. It's like this idea that if we understand the way that karma unfolds, the way that what we do has effect, the effect on other people, the effect on ourselves, the effect on the world, if we actually really see that, and we really take it on, then we will naturally do the right thing. So I think that's the better form of learning, but sometimes just not wanting to get caught can be a useful shorthand to it.
All right, so perhaps we'll draw the session to a close, and I know Ingrid wants to say something in a second, but Caroline is doing her workshop, and I can testify because there was I attended the presentation she did at Northampton, other centred therapy, and it is quite a different way of looking at psychotherapy, I found. So you'll find that very interesting, I'm sure. And also, of course, you can discuss questions with Caroline over the weekend. So,
there are a few print-offs of the...
all right, there's some off-prints of the slides. Perhaps give another expression of our appreciation then. An interesting talk.